Hello, and thanks for joining me. Today, I want to talk a bit about arranging some perspective for where we are in terms of this global pandemic, and specifically how it impacts people in learning and development. In my role as an evangelist for Adobe, I deal frequently with digital learning solutions across all the range of different kinds of learning programs and digital solutions that exist for various organizations. And this has been a really fascinating time. We've seen that consistently it has sort of accelerated an already present tendency to move more and more content into a virtual context. So this rapid virtualization came upon us not as a shock or not as something that was unanticipated or even unwanted, but it came upon us really, really quickly and much more rapidly than was expected. I'm going to present to you some research that we've done by asking questions of 800 leaders in the field of learning and development, folks who are directors of learning, who are chief learning officers and the like, all of whom have been asked a series of questions about their programs, their trends toward virtualization, and their potential takes, where they are and how their organization is actually responding to it. I want to frame that, however, and give you some context overall to kind of consider where we are and what kind of a world we're rapidly shifting toward. And so we'll start with a little bit of a frame to kind of understand exactly what's going on in the world. Suddenly, millions of people were forced to work remotely who had not been working remotely prior to the global pandemic and people starting to become sequestered in their homes. And now we have a situation where an enormous section of technology workers and workers who are primarily knowledge workers are able to work from home offices, but they weren't necessarily prepared to work from those home offices. So if you think about that for a minute, there are some pretty broad implications. Because when a society as a whole suddenly shifts the manner in which work is done, there's a big change for everyone at every level. I think the illustration sort of tells the story, right? That suddenly people were being asked to work from kitchen tables, from back offices, from couches, and so on, and being asked suddenly to care for children who were at home, who probably weren't at home prior to that, and suddenly being called upon to do all kinds of things around their homes. The shift is fairly substantial, fairly dramatic, and depending on where you are in the world, it can be substantial in different kinds of ways. Suddenly, if you had in-home help or assistants who were helping you with household tasks and things like that, they might not have been able to come in and assist. You might have found that your child's education resources were no longer accessible, and you were being asked to fill in as teacher and still maintain your job responsibilities and still maintain your life responsibilities, and everything all happening all at one time. And so it can be fairly hectic. And it means rapid adaptation for individuals who are in those circumstances. And that adaptation it can bring with it a whole lot of baggage in terms of trepidation about what's next. There can be concerns about whether or not their job is secure, your overall world is secure, your home is secure. And all of these withering away of regular securities are going to lead to gaps in your confidence, and they're going to lead to lots of kind of strife in terms of figuring out exactly where you are. So it's important for those of us who are in management and leadership to understand from a strategic point of view that the personnel who are on the front lines actually doing the work have suddenly had a major adaptation fall upon them. And that's going to change the way that their world works. And for those of us in L&D, the challenge is to effectively communicate with everyone in our organization all of the different kinds of things that are going to be necessary. Now, that includes new skills that may have to be learned. It also includes new strategies and approaches, People may have to reorganize what their approach is to the specific tasks that they had in mind, or scrap them and consider entirely new functions. We've also seen through this event that people in L&D have tended to collaborate quite actively with people who are in communications, people who are in ops teams, people who are in legal teams, and across the organization as a whole, in order to scramble quite quickly and provide at least part of that communication. And so that leads to a lot of adaptation for everybody in the L&D space as well. Now, one of the things that you're going to discover, if you haven't already, is that productivity is likely to immediately spike in the wake of a major transition event like this. That's because people are nervous and uncertain about whether or not their job will be there for them. They want to make sure that their performance is good. And they may be nervous about performance related to suddenly being thrust online, not sure they can use the new technologies, not sure that they can provide all of the necessary kind of safety net that they're typically able to provide. They also might be uncertain about being outside of the office environment. So what the research shows is that, in fact, there's a spike in productivity as soon as people move to this kind of online space. And that's been the same during this pandemic time. In fact, about 30% increased productivity is fairly typical. But it also shows that there are then depressions in the resulting performance that come soon after. And that, in fact, you're likely to get a kind of an up and down performance enhancement experience, because there are other kinds of things to consider. One, people can't keep burning at a 30% increase for long stretches of time without getting exhausted. Two, all of these new factors are going to influence the way that they're able to work and cause them to slow down at some points. The emotional and psychological aspects are going to play a significant role. And there'll also be a need for people to go back to the sort of planning and strategy board to readdress those things that they had planned to do and discover those things that they will do instead. So while productivity will and does spike, it's really important to monitor that and be sure that the falls that will come quite naturally as a result of that up-down kind of motion are something that you're prepared for and that you're managing for, so that you're actually anticipating that those patterns will exist and possibly even working actively to prevent kind of burnout experiences, because you don't want a long-term burnout, right? If you need to have some irregularity in output, that's fine. Just anticipate it and figure out ways to relieve those tensions for those folks who are working beneath you. There's also a really significant and serious potential for increased anxiety here. People could have members of their household who are sick, and that carries with it a whole bunch of unknowns. People could easily have lost someone in their family. And there are anxieties just around the move, the shift to a different kind of work experience. For many people, day-to-day office social activities are a very real and influential part of what makes them comfortable and happy. And whenever we're suddenly severed from a pre-existing kind of normal state to a new state, that leads to a natural grieving. And so people are very likely in a pattern of grieving and may not have addressed what that change actually means for them. So it's important to be aware that all of those factors can play a really important role. They also may have anxiety about when they return to office, or if they return to office, or should they return to office. One of the interesting things about working with huge teams from India and around the world is that the US has been a bit ahead in the pandemic in terms of having pandemic activity, right? So I think if we look at it, we can see that the US is about 2 to 4 weeks further along the pipe. And I don't necessarily think that the US's response to the pandemic has been a model by any means. I think there have been extremely significant problems there. But it's worth noting that the same kinds of problems are going to occur for each location, regardless of circumstance, right? So they're going to be similar kinds of reactions, and it's important to scout for those, be aware of them, and take active measures to prevent them from causing you serious problems. And from the people on your team, serious problems. One of the other impacts here is zero travel suddenly being thrust upon people. Most organizations are traveling quite frequently, both domestically and around the world. And that has some positive aspects. I mean, chief technology officers have been contemplating for quite some time a couple of major factors. One is having people work from home and thereby reducing the footprint of brick and mortar offices. Is that a potential cost savings that could, in fact, benefit the organization? And two, what about travel? Are all of the events that we travel for actually necessary? I know I myself would frequently, pre-pandemic, travel to a city to do a morning presentation that actually took me in the presentation space to about 2 to 3 hours. But the entire trip was usually 2 or more days. That means airfare, means hotel costs, it means all of my time away from my normal duties, all to do that very brief presentation one morning. The New York Times Magazine did an interesting article about 2 weeks ago, which was about sales personnel and how they were actually responding. They featured a specific sales individual who was selling automated vacuum cleaners that would roam around the hallways of large industrial buildings and hotels and do the cleanup, do the vacuuming automatically. And he described a situation where he had a 15-minute on-site demo. And it was not at all uncommon for him to fly all the way across the country, set up all his heavy equipment, put together the demo, and then for only 10 to 15 minutes to see the actual customer. The customer would then see that the device did exactly what it claimed it would do, and he would nod and go ahead and purchase one or more of those devices. And so, one of the things that had to be considered for that organization and is being considered for organizations like it all over the world is, is that a giant waste of money? Is that a huge carbon footprint impact, which is absolutely unnecessary? Couldn't that be done remotely with video? And in fact, the same company today is now doing it remotely with video. I know that Adobe is taking similar steps, and I've had the fortune of speaking with CLOs and directors of learning from all over the world, all of whom are telling me that virtualization of regular work is absolutely something that they've been able to make the transition toward in many, many cases. So it's worth noting that is both a cost reduction and an environmental benefit, and it doesn't seem to be substantially slowing down even activities that we might have really passionately believed required physical presence. Telepresence has become, in fact, really powerful and a good option. So the other thing that is implied here is one that the research was starting to indicate, and I hadn't seen some evidence until just 2 days ago when Forbes magazine ran an interesting article which started to follow some of the real estate trends that are actually happening. So the theory behind this is essentially, what if we actually do have an impact where more and more people are working from home? We know already that as much as 50% of personnel surveyed said that they would in fact prefer to work from home even post-pandemic. So while it's very likely that post-pandemic people will return to offices, it's also already known that in many organizations that will not be the case, that this was their leap to virtualization, virtual offices, and working remotely, and that they'll continue to do that. There are global implications there. One of them is that urban areas may become less dense, and that may push people to move out into outer rings, to more remote rings, suburban areas, or even to rural areas, in order to have a lower cost of living, in order to reap the benefits that come naturally with moving away from urban centers. Now, for some people, it's urban all the way. They're never going to want to shift. For other people, they very much would prefer to do so. And so the early indicators are starting to appear, at least in the US, that suggest that there's a real estate shift happening where urban centers are starting to loosen up in terms of their real estate offerings, and where suburban areas and countryside areas are looking more appealing. Now, obviously, there would have to be network infrastructure in place. There would have to be support structures in place in order to accommodate people who are moving away from urban centers, but it's worth a thought because it may reduce the pressure on pay for personnel who are living further away from urban centers. It may reduce pressure for things like traffic in very highly trafficked urban centers. I know I have many colleagues who work out of Bangalore, and pre-pandemic, they would often make note of their commute times, which could range from anywhere from an hour to 3 hours, sometimes more, depending on the season and the traffic. And that's a tremendous amount of daytime lost to a commute. So there's a huge appeal there for people if they can avoid that commute. There's definite interest there, I'm sure, in people getting away from it. Now, I want to show you some of that detailed data in terms of the survey. This was a survey of 800 leaders in learning and development. One of the interesting notes here is that we asked folks, was your industry able to move to remote work? And nearly 80% reported that most of all of their L&D employees were able, in fact, to move to remote work, which kind of makes sense, right? Much of learning and development is delivered online, and part of this task was virtualizing that content. It makes sense that most folks were able to do that with their L&D departments at least. We asked them, how did their organization address in-person learning initiatives in the wake of the pandemic? And 86% said that their organization shifted some, most, or all of their formerly face-to-face training to virtual training. Again, not a surprise, but interesting to see that the numbers are very strong, that there's not a lot of hesitation here. I suspect that's because organizations were already considering the merits and there was a strong incentive. It's a way to continue work, to make work continue to happen without having to kind of succumb to the pressures of being unable to gather people together in a physical space. We asked what percentage of the classroom trainings have been or will be converted to virtual learning programs within 2020. Nearly 40% were expecting to convert classroom training by the end of this year. Now, some interesting notes there. One is whenever you ask people, what do you expect? Usually you can figure that that number is going to be about 50% in the end. People expect to do something all the time. It doesn't mean they're actually going to succeed. Historically, when I've seen surveys like that, when you see that expectation question, it should give you an intent metric, but it shouldn't give you an actual sense of what the outcomes were. The other thing to note is that on affective order considerations, things like emotional intelligence, things like leadership strategy, those are the things that have been real laggards in terms of transitioning to virtual, away from face-to-face. And so those continue to be the ones that bring real challenges to organizations. It's worth noting that organizations have found ways to virtualize even those management training, leadership training kinds of pieces of content. And there's some really interesting programs going on at organizations all over the world now to try and get those things to be virtual. We asked, was the learning function involved in preparing employees for a shift to remote work? This is really about the communication and whether or not the facilitation of corporate communication, organizational information sharing, and so on was reliant to some extent on the learning and development group. 65% said that the L&D was involved in the process for the shift to remote work. We took that a little bit further and wanted to drill down and understand, what was the reaction then if L&D was becoming critical in terms of reacting and facilitating this shift. We found that 84% said that L&D proved their value through the course of this transition. 91% said that they in fact think that much of what they've done is a permanent change. Look at that number, 91% think this is a permanent change. So an accelerated delivery of virtualized content, and virtually all of the folks believe that that's permanent, that this is their intent, is to transition this over to the way that things go in the future. 64% felt technically prepared. So of the L&D folks who are out there, about 64% felt like they had the technical preparation their team was technically prepared to be able to deliver it. And then we found that 91% felt that their team was appropriately skilled, that they had the necessary skills to be able to put the whole thing together. Ask them, in response to the crisis, did the learning function increase their functional collaboration with other departments? And if so, what were those other departments? 80% reported increased cross-functional collaboration. And as you look your way down, you'll see that HR, IT, and operations were the primary ones that were collaborating effectively with L&D. Then we asked, what strategies or tactics have your teams adopted to ensure learning programs are more effective during this time of crisis? And 71% reported increased use of learning platforms. So for the most part, they were turning to their LMS, their LRS, their learning platforms to deliver this content. And that's absolutely anecdotally what we saw at Adobe. So Adobe, of course, produces digital learning solutions across the entire range, including authoring tools and learning management solutions, deployment, virtual conferencing, virtual learning spaces, and so on. And for our learning management system, this was fairly simple to track. So we saw that immediately post-pandemic, there was a 2x surge in the amount of use that our customers were doing on their already existing learning management system. So overnight, the load doubled, right? And we saw spikes in that load post-pandemic of anywhere from 2 times to 22 times what it had been pre-pandemic. And similar reports have been coming in from virtual conferencing solutions. We saw that in our own Adobe Connect. We saw it in our learning management system, Adobe Captivate Prime. And we saw upticks in all of those metrics around all of those kinds of solutions. So it's definitely clear that people are creating more content, they're delivering more content, they're deploying it on their learning management systems, and they're having more virtual conferencing sessions and virtualizing the content experience overall. Now, I should mention in that context that Adobe does have digital learning solutions across the board, including authoring tools like Adobe Captivate, which is the industry-leading tool for creating content, management tools like Captivate Prime, and delivery tools like Adobe Connect. I also want to mention that available in our virtual booth is a detailed deck, which I prepared around the question of designing and deploying critical skills training for employees who are suddenly working from home. So in that deck, I put together a set of ideas and guidelines for the critical skills that are most important. So if you're in L&D and you're trying to kind of nail it down and figure out what kinds of skills should I actually be examining, exploring, in terms of supporting personnel who are working remotely for the first time, check out that deck. I'd encourage you to do it. Check out our virtual booth, and there you'll find the report, including all the data that I've just shared with you, and also this deck, as well as a deck for the skills development. I want to thank you all and hope you have a great conference.